Okay, hello and welcome back to what I'm now going to call the Train Hopper. Thank you, Sean from Dieter's Discord for giving me the idea of the name, and I'm thinking that's going to be the name I'm going to stick with. Yeah, I should have done this earlier, but yeah, I kind of, pre-record a lot of these and don't really release them at a very good clip, so it took a while for me to come up with the name, and took help to come up with the name, and, the normal shenanigans. So today we are going to actually be talking about the Cascade and or Siskiyou line, which ran from Oakland to Portland under the Southern Pacific. This is probably actually going to be the last SP one for a while, because the next couple of videos that I'm going to end up doing are not going to be SP related, at least directly. And after that, I'm probably going to do a Santa Fe one just to break this up so it's not Southern Pacific centric. So anywho, we're going to be starting off today with describing the, SP lines connecting the Bay Area, which is Oakland, with Portland. So trains started running between California and Oregon in 1887, which is when the SP finished the Siskiyou line, which on the map that I should be thrown up is the one on the left of the red lines, where it kind of blobs out into a bowl. This route was finished, as I said, in 1887, which was about 13 years after the first line down the San Joaquin Valley was finished connecting the Bay Area with Los Angeles, and good solid was that 15 years before the coastline was completed, or at least 14 years for the basic completion, and 17 years before the full official completion of the coast route. And the the Siskiyou line runs from Weed, California, which is Black Butte, which is where it splits off, and runs to Eugene through Ashland, Medford, Grants Pass, Roseburg. So the Siskiyou line was not the SP's first choice according to some sources, because it was a very curvy and steep route, and the SP was always looking to get a less curvy and steep route between Oregon and California. And this route the Siskiyou line, was actually so slow that it took 5 hours for a passenger train to get from Weed to Ashland. And it took a bus approximately 2 hours once Highway 99 was opened, and takes about an hour and a half on by car on I-5 today. Also, these trains are about 7 cars long on average and were 3 times the weight of the current Talgo equipment that runs on the Amtrak Cascade route. And 7 cars is about a similar length between the two pieces of equipment. So it took 5 hours to effectively do what is today an hour and a half drive or a 2-hour bus ride. That was just an unacceptable amount of time to get between Oregon and California. So after a few decades, the SP decided to build a more direct route. This route was over Pengra Pass, which is now called the Natron Cutoff, or Natron. I'm not really sure how to pronounce that, so if I am mispronouncing that, I am sorry. This was a less steep and flatter route. More less steep and more flatter. You're still going over the Cascade Mountains. When it now on the map splits off, same spot, but it goes up through Klamath Falls and up over and into Eugene, as shown on the map. And this line was opened in 1926, and the passenger trains were basically rerouted over this within a few weeks of the line opening. And by 1930, there were only 2 passenger trains running on the Siskiyou line, so basically in less than 4 years, the Siskiyou line went from being the primary north-south connection to a secondary line. So the Shasta was the heavyweight predecessor to the Shasta Daylight that ran until 1939, and the last train through the Siskiyou line, last 3 trains, so that's the last train that actually went from Oregon to California over the Siskiyou line, was the Shasta, and it was discontinued in 1939. That's a better way to phrase this. Another impetus to build the Cascade line was the Western Pacific and Great Northern Railways were trying to build a line up the Central Valley to Oregon, I've only found this in one source, and I actually have not been able to re-find it, so if I am mistaken, again, I apologize because I was not able to re-find this source. According to them, they were trying to build a line up the Central Valley from Chico to Redding, and then over the mountains and up to Bend and Klamath Falls via the Sacramento Northern Railway, which at that point was a Western Pacific subsidiary. And the Great Northern was going to extend itself south to Klamath Falls, Oregon. And this would give the SP competition on the California to Oregon line, which, as a monopolistic company, the SP didn't want any competition. And eventually the Western Pacific and Great Northern didn't complete this connection through the valley, but they did create the Inside Gateway, which now on the map for the Inside Gateway, which is I did just take a screenshot of Google Maps and just draw it in paint. So the Inside Gateway was a railroad connect. Well, it is a railroad connection. It still is an active rail line between California and Oregon that runs on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The Western Pacific line was fairly indirect, and as you can see on the map, it actually runs south for a little bit before running east and then running north again. So the line started in the port of Oakland and ran south to what's now Fremont, and then ran east through Sinol Grade into the Livermore Valley, through Altamont Pass, and then up through Stockton and into Sacramento. And then it just kept shooting up the valley to Yuba City and Oroville, and then started winding its way through the mountains to Ketty Y, which I've actually forgotten to get a picture of, but it'll come up in the California Zephyr video, so we'll ignore that for now. After that, it basically just started meandering into the mountains through Ketty Y, kept meandering all the way up to Bieber, California, which is about where Modoc National Forest type is on the map over here. And then after that, it became the Great Northern all the way into Klamath Falls. And even though this line did exist, passenger trains never ran between Oakland and the Pacific Northwest over it, which likely had to do with the time it took the SP to run from Oakland to Portland, which was over 15 hours in the Streamline era. So I can't imagine that this line would have been any quicker, and it would probably have been a lot slower, so there was no reason to run a passenger train. And the 15-hour time, which we'll get into in a little bit, was actually one of the reasons that kind of killed passenger service north of the Bay Area and into Oregon. So I can't imagine that if 15 hours was the breaking point, I can't imagine that it's something that would have probably taken, and God knows how much longer, would have worked out well, especially after train service started declining. But freight trains regularly ran this corridor and was actually advertised in at least the Great Northern's system schedule. At the time, it did provide some competition with the Southern Pacific running north into the Pacific Northwest. So various trains did run the line between Oakland and Portland in the days before Amtrak. The heavyweight trains, which I'm just honestly just going to chuck in a picture of the, the SP commute train again, because there's really not any good pictures of these heavyweight trains other than the commute service. So I'm probably just going to chuck one of those in there. These heavyweight trains were the Klamath, the Beaver, the Oregonian, the Shasta, and the Rogue River. The last two ran the Siskiyou line, and the rest ran the Natrone Cutoff. The Klamath was a coach special, quote-unquote, train that ran between Oakland and Portland, and it offered coach seats for a discounted rate of $15 one way instead of $27 that the other trains would cost. The train also carried a few sleeping cars and tourist sleepers, and one of which actually ran on a connecting train to Seattle, which means you could at least get from Oakland to Seattle, even though you had to switch railways and deal with that old rigmarole, but you didn't have to change cars, which is a good thing. The Beaver was a coach and tourist sleeper that didn't have a connection with Seattle, and from what I can tell, the Klamath and the Beaver were more or less the Portland equivalent of the Owl and the Starlight that ran between the Bay Area and Los Angeles. The difference being that these trains were even further down the list of priorities than the Bay Area LA trains. And the last of the heavyweight trains, the Oregonian, seems to either be a long distance or within Oregon train. I'm not really sure because not much has really been recorded on these trains, sadly, because, well, history. And it did, but I just do know it did have a bunch of mail trains, and I do think it was local mail. I'm not really sure how far it ran. And again, these trains were never really streamlined, even though, and from what I can gather looking at the schedules, these were secondary and tertiary trains and were pretty much gone by the 1950s. Based on the system schedules. The last heavyweight train of note that ran this corridor was the West Coast, which ran all the way from Los Angeles to Portland. I misspelled Portland on my notes. Oh, God. It ran through Sacramento, which is notable because the other Oakland to Portland trains ran north from Davis, which is just east of Sacramento. So it actually missed the state capital by a good several miles. The West Coast did serve Sacramento and was combined with the Owl as far as Lathrop during the Depression years, and then ran up the valley to Portland. And although this train did connect two far-flung cities, it was actually cut like the rest of SP trains along the line, and in 1949 it was truncated to Sacramento, and the train was cut entirely in 1960. And when it did run to Portland, it did have a connecting car to Seattle, so kinda was the Coast Starlight of its day, but not really. And we'll get into that in just a brief moment after I get through the World War II section. So after World War II, there were two streamlined trains that ran between Oakland and Portland. These were the Shasta Daylight, which was launched in 1949, and the overnight Cascade, which was launched in 1950. The Shasta Daylight had all the same amenities as the Coast Daylight as discussed in its own episode, even down to the triple section diner and the red and orange paint. The main differences between the Shasta Daylight and the Cascade and the Coast Daylight, are that the Shasta Daylight cars had bigger windows to take in the views of the mountain ranges, mostly the Mount Shasta and the Cascades, and that the Shasta Daylight started out with diesel engines rather than steam engines, and the types of engines that were used were either EMDE units or Alco PAs. And also, we're going to look at the Cascade Club, which was the Cascade's version of the triple section diner. Was a difference between the post-war triple sections diners and the pre-war ones was that the kitchen was at one end, as shown on the diagram where it's all the way on the left. That car or section was the kitchen. There was dining sections in the middle, and then there was a tavern lounge on the other end, but you could walk all the way through these trains like you would a light rail vehicle today. And also, and like them, there were no doors, so you could just walk all the way through. And this was fairly unusual, even by today's standards. Like Amtrak doesn't do anything like this. And from what I can understand, the kitchen section also had space for crew quarters, like the Lark did on its triple section diner. Anyways, the southbound Daylight was timed to connect with the Owl after the what's it called, the West Coast was truncated to Sacramento, and which would provide a connection between Portland and Los Angeles, even though you had to make a transfer at the town of Martinez. The Shasta Daylight would then keep running to Portland, and then this line continued running until 1967, and it completed the journey in just under 16 hours. At this point, the train was in decline, and because of the long travel times was a big drain on ridership, because even back then flying was, even though being expensive, was still fairly cheaper, not really cheaper by comparison, but as time went on, flights were just faster. Like you can fly between like Oakland and Portland in 2 or 3 hours versus 16 hours on a train, which pretty much killed a lot of daytime trains, especially over those long routes. But the Cascade, on the other hand, continued running, but we'll get into that in a minute. The Cascade was the SP's premier overnight train that was a sister train to the Shasta Daylight and the Lark. And like the Lark, it was an all-Pullman train, which meant it only had sleeping cars. There were no coaches on it until it was combined with the Daylight in 1967, when the Daylight was dropped out of the schedule. This train carried the standard types of rooms for the time, that being roomettes, double bedrooms, compartments, and drawing rooms, which I did make a separate video on, so I'm not going to go into too much detail as to what that means. But to put it, to be quick about it, roomettes for one person in general. Double bedrooms had 2 bunk beds, which were for 2 people in general. Compartments were basically bigger double bedrooms. By the way, they all had their own toilet in the room, which was kind of a thing with bedrooms back then. And there were drawing rooms, which generally had 3 beds and were larger than compartments. And as I mentioned, the Cascade did survive until the creation of Amtrak in 1971, and in some small way did actually help save passenger rail on the West Coast by maintaining the connection between Oregon and California, which is now going to bring me to what has happened in this quarter in the years after Amtrak was created, and years, and actually at this point decades after the height of passenger rail in the United States. When the Cascade was taken over by Amtrak, it was running on a tri-weekly schedule, which meant that it ran south 3 days per week and then ran north on 3 alternating days, which is a pain if you're trying to plan a trip. And at the beginning of Amtrak's existence, the Cascade, the Coast Daylight, and one of the Seattle-Portland pool train connections, and one of the San Diegans, which ran from LA to San Diego, were all consolidated into one route that ran on a tri-weekly basis from San Diego to Seattle. And on the other 4 days of the week, the Coast Daylight ran as a semi-nameless train between Oakland and Los Angeles, which this continued on for about 3 years. And in the summer of 1973, the Starlight ran on a daily schedule. From what I understand, I think the Daylight still kept running. The Starlight ran on a daily basis. The Daylight ran on its 4-weekly basis. And this schedule was retained in 1974. And then in the spring of 1974, the Daylight was just dropped from the schedule altogether. And the San Diegan that was taken over by the Coast Starlight was just a San Diegan, and the Starlight was truncated to Los Angeles like it is today, which gives us the modern Coast Starlight. I keep wanting to call it the Coast Daylight. Oh god, poor habits of me trying to read history and do current events. So this brings us to where we are today. There were plans to start running trains between Sacramento and Redding, but due to Amtrak's long-standing equipment shortage and the state's utter ambivalence to passenger trains, there has been no extension of the existing service in years, and at this point the trains are frankly over a decade late, and the state still doesn't care to increase funding for Amtrak California, and has more or less done everything it can do to distance itself from the services in all but name. So again, it's not likely to happen. There are buses, by the way. There's I think it was way up to 4 buses now, these pre-coronavirus, that connects Sacramento to Redding. Sorry, wrong direction. So there's at least some connection, but it's not a train, and a train could run, and a train would be better because trains tend to generate more ridership than buses do. But anyways, that's a subject for a different video. And also I need to mention that the Starlight was rerouted slightly sometime, I believe in the 70s or the 80s. Originally it ran the Cascade route, so it ran north at Davis, missing Sacramento. The train was rerouted to go to Sacramento and take the more direct Western Pacific line north to Yuba City and then keep running up the valley along the Western Pacific tracks, and then onto the SP tracks wherever they switch. And the reason the SP didn't do this is because it was an SP track. Passenger trains from different competing railways at this time, because they were competing against each other, at least in theory, wouldn't let each other's passenger trains run on their tracks. And if they did, they usually were either extortionate or had to get the ICC involved, which frankly took a lot, or they would take a long time to come up to a judgment. Which brings me to one of the perks that Amtrak has over the old freight railways, which is it can run on any railroad in the United States. It has the legal authority to do so, which actually Amtrak and its legal environment is actually an entire video in and of itself. But because of the legislation that created Amtrak, they do have the legal authority to more or less use any railway in the country as if it were the railway's own train rather than a separate operator running on the tracks, which again is something that I'll have to get into in a separate video. But this means that expanding service, if were to happen between Sacramento and Reading, would have no direct predecessor and would be a brand new route. Which also brings us to the Oregon side of things. Back in the 90s, I think it was 99 or 98, so basically almost to the 2000s, Oregon did run an exposition train between Portland and Ashland to try to drum up support for a train. It used the Talgo equipment that it uses on the Cascades, and I think it made 1 or 2 runs. I'm not sure. I can't really find an exact number, but nothing came of this. And the Siskiyou line is still in operation and ownership of the Central Oregon and Pacific Railroad. And I think Union Pacific, for a brief stint, they're just leasing it to the short line operator. Which brings us to the end of this video. Thank you for watching. This one I think is shorter, maybe. Nah, it's probably going to be about the same length after I edit this down. But anyways, yeah, this is going to be the end of this. I will see you in the next one, which I'm not really sure what I'm going to do. It's either going to be a long opinion one, or it's going to be the super chief, San Francisco chief, basically the chiefs that ran between Chicago and the West Coast on the Santa Fe. So we'll stay tuned for that, and hope to see you in the next one. Please leave your comments and likes and subscriptions and whatnot all down below. I like hearing from you guys. So, well, when you do, guys, do comment. So just, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you in the next one.